Hi, this is Miss Nikki, and today we're going to talk about... Hi, my name is Miss Nikki, and today we're going to talk about a subset of Chapter 16, specifically the adrenal glands. First, I just want to make sure that we know it by another term. Sometimes it's called suprarenal, as stated here on the slide. Super obviously means superior, above, renal, another word for kidneys. So these are those little, now you can see in the picture here, these little, my pen is just acting crazy today. There we go. Okay. These little pyramid-shaped glands that sit directly on top of your kidneys, and we'll learn about why they're there in just a second when we talk about aldosterone. So pretty much this is two glands in one. So we're going to split this up. First I'm going to talk about the adrenal cortex, and then in the next video I'm going to talk about the adrenal medulla. So the first one that we're going to talk about is really glandular tissue. And this glandular tissue is going to secrete something here on the slide. You can see corticosteroids. And there's three different types. I know that Ms. Nicholas already went over the different zones in the previous and talked a little bit about some of the hormones that are going to be released during this process. So I'm going to take it into a little bit more detail. And then the second thing I'm going to talk about is the adrenal medulla. This is nervous tissue. So we're going to see two different levels of stimulus here. If you haven't looked at it already, you should go back and look at humoral stimulus, neural stimulus, and hormonal stimulus. So if you haven't covered those yet, you should look at those real quick before I start talking about some of this, because you might be thrown off. Okay. So the three layers, and again, I know you've already seen the zones here, but of the corticosteroids that are in the adrenal cortex, I have another name listed here in red. This is what we mostly refer to the items that are produced from these different zones of the adrenal cortex. So if you have the zona glomerulosa, it's going to produce something called mineral corticoids. And I should put an example here. This is the one that we're going to talk about the most, aldosterone. If we're talking about the next zone there, we're going to see glucocorticoids. The best example is cortisol. And then the last zone there, you can see these are gonatocorticoids. They all end in corticoids, right? That's why they're called corticosteroids. And these are the gonatocorticoids are really just sex hormones. But you should know each layer, and you should know which corticoids it produces, and be able to give an example of each kind. So let's break these down. Look at the picture again, and then I'll break each one down. So you can see the different zones, and I know there was a cute little thing that Ms. Nicholas did about the rapids, and then you want to have sex at the end, so I'm sure you guys got a kick out of that. Mine's going to be a little bit more dry. I don't get to do the fun stuff. I got to break it all down and tell you how it works. So hopefully we remember these. Just make sure you know that the mineral corticoids are going to come from the first zone here. The second zone is where we're going to have our glucocorticoids, and then the last one is where we're going to have our gonatocorticoids released. And then I'll have to come back and talk about the adrenal medulla next video. Okay, so mineral corticoids. The one that we're going to talk about specifically is aldosterone. It's the most important mineral corticoid that's released. This is going to help regulate your electrolyte balance. Primarily, we're talking about sodium and potassium, and hopefully we remember from 201 the levels of sodium and potassium directly relate to muscle function and neuron function, right? So it is important that we have a set level of sodium and potassium. So when aldosterone is released, it's going to monitor or regulate the amount of electrolytes that you have in your system. So I put up here the importance of sodium and potassium just in case we didn't remember. Importance of sodium, maintaining our what's ECF, extracellular fluid volume, right? We need to have more sodium on the outside of the cell than on the inside to start to trigger the entire process of contraction, right, or nerve transmission. So the amount of sodium also affects blood volume and blood pressure, and we'll see in just a minute pretty much the sodium and water volume are interchangeable. Where one goes, the other is going to go. And that has to do with osmosis when we talked about diluting out a solute. So maybe you might have to go back and look at osmosis again. So basically what does aldosterone do? It stimulates sodium reabsorption, and then water is going to follow that sodium reabsorption. So if we're taking sodium out of our urine, we don't want it to be excreted. We want to keep a hold of that sodium. We're also going to keep a hold and retain water. And all of this is happening in the kidneys, which makes sense why the adrenal glands are atop the kidneys, right? The message doesn't have very far to go. Okay. This is a lot of wording, so don't freak out. I've highlighted the main players that we need to talk about, but we're really going to look at the picture next, and the picture is really going to help us make sense of all of these words. But there are several mechanisms that can trigger aldosterone secretion. So it's not just one thing, oh, we need to retain sodium, we're going to release aldosterone. There are several mechanisms that can cause aldosterone to be released from the adrenal cortex. And the last one here at the end is a way that we can inhibit aldosterone release. And we'll see in just a second why that would be important. So we have a renin-angiotensin mechanism. If we're trying to decrease blood pressure, again, I'm going to wait till the picture to really get into this, plasma concentration, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, hopefully we have already talked about that, and then this ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. So let's look at those and see what they do. The picture is the best way to do that. Let me get my pen ready. Okay, so the first mechanism that I talked about was the renin-angiotensin, right? And what's the main goal of this? Excreting aldosterone, right? And then eventually, what is aldosterone going to do? Reabsorb sodium and make water retention happen as well. So in this very first one, you can see renin-angiotensin. If you have decreased blood volume, and what do we mean by decreased blood volume? You do not have enough water, right? The amount or volume of your blood is low. Remember, your plasma is mostly water, so that's the water concentration we're talking about. So if your blood volume is low, you're going to have this renin released. The renin is going to, it has a cascade effect, kind of like blood clotting and some of the other ones that we've talked about. Renin is going to initiate angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is going to go directly to the adrenal cortex, particularly this zone, and cause the excretion of aldosterone. What does aldosterone do? It targets the kidney tubules, and we haven't talked about the kidneys tubules yet, but pretty much you'll see that later on in the semester. But it's a specific area that can regulate whether water or sodium stays or goes in the body. So this aldosterone triggers the kidney tubules, and what are they going to do? They're going to absorb sodium. I almost said calcium. They're going to absorb sodium, and they're going to increase potassium. So they're going to get rid of potassium, it's going to take in or absorb sodium, and what did I say? If the sodium gets reabsorbed, the water's going to follow. What is the water going to do? It's going to be reabsorbed or retained from these kidney tubules. It's going to go back into your blood circulation. So what did we want the overall process to do? If we had low blood volume, what happens if we keep more water instead of excreting it? Well, hopefully you got it right that you know the blood volume is going to go up. So pretty much this is a basic mechanism for retaining fluid or retaining water, and that's what aldosterone does. The next regulator is this increase in potassium in the blood. And you can look right here, I'll try to use a different color, you can look right here, what is a byproduct of aldosterone secretion? It increases sodium retention, and it also increases water retention, but as a byproduct, it increases sodium excretion. Well, this is cut and dry, right? If we have too much potassium in our blood, what does the release of aldosterone do? Gets rid of more potassium. Stress. This is another factor. This is if your hypothalamus secretes this cortico-releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, that's going to cause your anterior pituitary to release the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and then that's going to have the effect of excreting aldosterone. If you excrete aldosterone, you're going to have increased blood volume, increased blood pressure. Why is this important for stress? What do you have to do when you're stressed out? If a bear is chasing you, what do you have to do? You have to be able to run and, fight or flight, right? You have to be able to run. You have to have the ability to do that. You need to increase your heart rate. You need to increase your blood pressure, to get blood moving more effectively, hopefully get more glucose and more oxygen to your muscles so your muscles can make more ATP so you can continue to run from the bear, right? Okay. This last one is an inhibitory effect. Basically what, I'm running out of colors. Basically what A&P is going to do is it's going to inhibit this renin. That's its main function. It doesn't say that here in the slide. I'm just telling you that. So what is it going to do? It inhibits the release. So it stops aldosterone from being released. If aldosterone is not released, what's going to happen? You're not going to have sodium absorption. You're not going to have water retention. So what's going to happen to your blood volume? It's going to go down, right? If we're not pulling in more water, our blood volume is going to go down, therefore our blood pressure is going to go down. And what is this in response to? Why do we release A&P? If our blood pressure is too high, we want to bring that down by this mechanism. So what I would do is really take a look at this picture and make sure that you can walk through the steps like we just did in this video and it makes sense to you, which I know is asking a lot. Okay, so we have to talk about some of the homeostatic imbalances at the same time. So every time I'm done explaining a particular hormone, then I'm going to talk about some of the either hyper or hyposecretion of that particular hormone. If I only mention hyper, that's the one you really need to know, either the hypo or whichever one I don't mention. There may not be really a great effect, so I'm not going to bother mentioning it. So hypersecretion here is something called aldosteronism. You can see it's usually due to adrenal tumors. Hopefully you've already talked about the case study with the thyroid, so you kind of have an idea of what a tumor can do. But if you have a tumor growth in your adrenal cortex, you have more cells secreting more aldosterone. That's going to cause hypersecretion. And what's the main goal of aldosterone? Increase sodium absorption and increase water retention. So what do you think is going to happen? Eventually, if you have too much water, you're going to have increased blood volume, which is going to have increased blood pressure, so you're going to have hypertension. Also, you're also going to have excessive sodium, because that's what aldosterone does, right? And you're going to have increased excretion of potassium. So this is, and I put abnormal funk, I should have typed out function there, right? But basically, this is going to put the system out of whack. You're going to have too much aldosterone, and it's going to cause effects that you don't want, right? It's going to take you out of that homeostatic balance. Okay, so let's move on to the second zone that we talked about, and that's going to release glucocorticoids, right? This is pretty much cortisol. And I just gave you some little bullets here, and then we'll move into a little bit more specific. So this is going to help you adapt to intermittent food intake. What does that mean? This means it's allowing you to have, you don't have to eat every 5 seconds, right? Sometimes we eat a lot, sometimes we eat a little bit. Cortisol, you should also think about stress, which we'll talk about in a minute. It keeps your blood sugar levels relatively constant. So we don't have too much, we don't have too little, and again, you'll talk about insulin a little bit later, so I'm not going to get into that when you talk about the pancreas. And this is going to help maintain blood pressure as well by increasing vasoconstriction. And hopefully by now we understand that if we make the blood vessel smaller, that's going to increase the pressure on the wall of the vessel, right? As the blood is flowing through a tinier tube, it's going to increase the pressure on that tube. So again, let's look at some of the more specifics. It is released directly in response to the ACTH. So, and this will help regulate patterns of eating and activity and stress. It's all going to be, these are going to trigger ACTH to be released, which is going to trigger the glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol, to be released. The prime metabolic effect is gluconeogenesis, and I have stated right here, formation of glucose from fats and proteins. So not consuming glucose, but also regulating the amount of glucose that you have in your body through other methods. It's also, when we say making glucose from fats and proteins, I think back in 201 we talked basically about the fact that glucose is a source that you need to make ATP, right? So we really want to take glucose plus oxygen and we want to turn it into ATP. But we also said as a secondary energy source, you could take lipids or fats, right? And you could turn those into ATP. but it takes a lot longer. There's more byproduct, you need more enzymes. It's more complicated to take a lipid and turn it into ATP than just plain glucose. So that's what this is talking about. We're saying we're making glucose from fats and proteins. This is to maintain the amount of glucose that you have in your bloodstream. This is obviously going to promote, if you have an increase in gluconeogenesis, you're going to have an increase in glucose in your blood. And then the fatty acids, as they're being turned into glucose, have to be released from the adipose tissue or adipocytes. So you have to be able to get it out. So therefore, you're going to have more fatty acids in your bloodstream to begin with before you can turn them into glucose and then eventually ATP. I keep saying this is the stress hormone. And I want to point out, no, I didn't there. Let me go back. Point out that when you're under a lot of stress, why do you want to make lots of ATP? So hopefully I don't have to really talk about this again because I've written it down here. But obviously if you have that bear chasing you, you want more glucose so that you can make more ATP so that you can run farther, right? So a lot of times this is called the stress hormone, because in response to stress, you're going to release these cortisols and they're going to help you stay alive. Another thing that the book mentions that will come up again a little bit later when we talk about reproduction is that this gluconeogenesis is really good because you want to conserve your glucose levels for your brain. Your brain needs to metabolize pure glucose. Your neurons like glucose better than they like lipids to turn into glucose. We don't have all the same processes. And again, there's a lot more chemical waste when you're turning this lipid into glucose and then into ATP. So again, in a stressful situation, let's take our fats, let's turn them into glucose and then into ATP because we need it, but also let's conserve whatever glucose we have left over for the brain to metabolize and make ATP because it's easier for the brain to do it that way. Okay. Excuse me, I just got over being sick. I was sick for about 10, 12 days, so finally feeling well enough to do this. So again, let's go back and talk about homeostatic imbalance, hypersecretion and hyposecretion. The hypersecretion too much. So if you're excreting too much cortisol, you have something called Cushing's syndrome. I always want to throw an R in there and say Cushing's, but Cushing's syndrome, I said it right. And this is going to do a couple of things. It's going to decrease cartilage and bone formation. It's going to inhibit inflammation. It's going to depress the immune system. And it's going to promote changes in cardiovascular, neural, and even your gastrointestinal or stomach to intestinal functions. And what's interesting about this hypersecretion is that sometimes we do this artificially. There's a picture coming up of somebody that's suffering from Cushing's syndrome, and they have it in the book, but a lot of times people are given cortisol if they have an autoimmune disorder. So if it depresses the immune system, if you give somebody whose immune system is attacking their joints or any of the cells in the body, it's going to depress the immune system. Also, it's going to prohibit or lessen inflammation. So if you have arthritis or anything that's causing inflammation, sometimes they'll give you cortisol as well. But you can see that this is not a long-term, not something you want to take long-term because it does have all of these important functions that are going to be changed due to this gluconeogenesis. Hyposecretion here, this Addison's disease, this is also can happen if you don't have, if you have a deficient amount of mineralocorticoids. So I have here mineralocorticoids, which is what we just talked about, aldosterone, right? So this is a disease that is, you would say it's more of an adrenal cortex disease. It affects both if you have too few mineralocorticoids or too few glucocorticoids. And this will see a decrease in glucose. So the whole point is making glucose available, right? So if you don't have enough of mineralocorticoids or glucocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, I'm talking about glucose, right? It's got gluco in it, so we're talking about glucose. And it will also reduce the sodium levels. So this has to do with glucocorticoids. Reducing the sodium levels has to do with mineralocorticoids, because remember, mineralocorticoids, we're talking about aldosterone, and it brings or retains sodium. So if you don't have enough mineralocorticoids or aldosterone, you're not going to have enough sodium. If you don't have enough glucocorticoids, you're not going to make enough glucose. So hyposecretion, Addison's disease, for both mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. And then some of the others, you're going to have weight loss. You're going to have severe dehydration because you're not retaining water with that sodium, right? And you're also going to have hypertension, or I don't know if I said hypotension. Why would we have hypotension? Hopefully we realize I've said it more than once, right? If the sodium level decreases, you don't retain sodium, you don't retain water, which is where the dehydration comes in. If you have low water, what's going to happen to your blood volume and what's going to happen to your blood pressure? They're all going to go down. Okay, excuse me. And this is the patient with Cushing syndrome, and you can see these are just some of the diagnostic characteristics that'll show up. They talk about a moon face, so you can definitely see that there's some changes going on here in her chin area, more of a flattened face rather than a pronounced face, kind of puffy. And then this not so nice name, buffalo hump, but this kind of fat cushion that ends up showing up on the back of the neck, cervical region. Okay, the last one that we're going to talk about when we talk about adrenal cortex are these gonatocorticoids. Hopefully, gonads, we should be thinking about sex hormones, and I did put that in the previous slide, so hopefully we understood that. Most are androgens. We talk about the male sex hormone, that most of the time we consider androgens the precursor to testosterone, but it's also the precursor to testosterone or estrogen. I'm not going to get into the estradiols or the breakdown of estrogen or testosterone or androgens. It's a little more complicated than we need to get into. Basically, we're talking about sex hormones, androgens that are going to be converted into testosterone or estrogen. And what these are going to do is they're going to trigger pretty much the onset of puberty. So you can see here I have a list. Triggers puberty, triggers secondary sexual characteristics. In females that would be breasts forming, in males that would be facial hair, and then the sex drive. So these gonatocorticoids are also responsible for sex drive. A lot of people don't realize that males produce both testosterone and estrogen, and females produce both testosterone and estrogen. Females have more estrogen and males have more testosterone, but that the level of testosterone in females is directly responsible for sex drive as well as in males, right? We often say he's got too much testosterone, right? He's constantly searching for somebody, right? Well, same thing for females. Your level of testosterone determines your sex drive. So basically what's going to happen, and I kind of skipped, let me make sure, yeah. So basically what's going to happen is these gonatocorticoids are going to be released from the adrenal cortex, and they are going to trigger your reproductive tissue to the onset of puberty and these secondary sexual characteristics. Once the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female start producing their own testosterone and estrogen, then this is still produced, but it's not the primary source of your sex hormones. So this is kind of like getting it going. It's like the kickoff, right? And then once your ovaries and testes get up to a mature size and level, we're going to secrete enough, I shouldn't say size, that's probably not the right word. They don't grow in size as we mature, but as they develop, they're going to secrete their own estrogen and testosterone. Is this still secreted? Yes. Okay, so what happens if you have too much, or I didn't put down too few here. It's a little unclear, so I've really just left the hypersecretion, what's going to happen. Hypersecretion, adrenogenital syndrome is what they call it. In adult males, it doesn't seem to cause that much of a problem because in adult males, they've already developed their secondary sexual characteristics and traits. So it doesn't really seem to cause that much of a problem if you're automatically secreting too much of your gonadotropin hormones. Again, it's not the main source, right? By the time you're an adult, your testes is producing the majority of it. So if you have a deficiency here in the gonatocorticoids, it's not such a big deal. But in young males, This, remember, is the trigger for puberty. So in young males, if you have a hypersecretion of gonatocorticoids in your adrenal cortex, you're going to develop your sexual secondary characteristics prematurely. In young females, this can cause problems as well. Again, when we're talking about androgens, we're talking about testosterone, and we said in females the estrogen is high, the testosterone is lower. But if you have a hypersecretion, a female may have more testosterone. That's going to cause male characteristics in females. So here you can see beard development, masculine patterns of body hair, also enlarged clitoris, which we haven't gotten to talk about the reproductive system yet, but pretty much the clitoris and the male penis are analogous. They're the same kind of material, so where testosterone would trigger the development of the penis, then the hypersecretion of testosterone could also enlarge the clitoris. Okay, I'll see you next lecture. In just a second, I'll split it up for you and we'll talk about the adrenal medulla. Thanks, bye. Okay, back to talk about adrenal medulla. This one's pretty simple. There's only a couple slides here, not much to really cover. Some concepts more than so many layers, right? So the adrenal medulla is going to be the inner portion. And hopefully we can go back and look at the cortex being on the outside, the medulla being on the inside. If you don't, you'll see it in lab when you look at the slides. But we have specific cells inside the adrenal medulla, these chromaffin cells, and they secrete catecholamines, or catecholamines, however you say it, but I say catecholamines. These, just like we talked about mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids and gonatocorticoids, you need to know this name as well, not just that it's epinephrine and norepinephrine. They are two different types of catecholamines. So these cells secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, 80%, 20%. It's not an even. They produce both, but more epinephrine. What do these hormones do? You could think of these as adrenaline, right? So they're going to cause blood glucose levels to rise. They're going to cause blood vessels to constrict, increase blood pressure, right? They're going to cause your heart to beat faster. And they're going to cause blood to be diverted to your major organs, so your skeletal muscle or major organs for fight or flight, sympathetic, right? So to your brain, your heart, and your skeletal muscles. Again, that analogy, the bear is chasing you. What do you need to do? You need to increase blood pressure. You need to increase your heart rate. You need to have blood diverted to your heart and your skeletal muscles to get more glucose, more oxygen, to produce more ATP, right? Even though we have both of these hormones, they each kind of have their own tasks that they're better at. So they can both exert the same effects, but epinephrine is better at stimulating these particular functions. So you can see metabolic activities, bronchial dilation, in your lungs, right? Blood flow to your skeletal muscles. Why would your bronchioles want to dilate? You want to be able to get more oxygen in, right? Okay, norepinephrine influences, it's better at vasoconstriction. And again, hopefully we can look at this and automatically know vasoconstriction. If we constrict the blood vessel, what is that going to do? It's going to increase blood pressure, right? And then we also talk here about increasing your heart rate. That's going to cause blood flow to get more quickly to your skeletal muscles. What are they going to drop off? They're going to drop off glucose and oxygen, and that's going to create more ATP so that they can actually do their job and you can run away from your attacker. Okay, this is an overall picture of kind of everything we've been talking about. So I want you to notice the difference here at the top between short-term and long-term. So get the pen going when it will. No, see? There we go. Okay, so here we have short-term stressors. So this is that equivalent of like adrenaline, right? So here's stress. Somebody's chasing you. It's going to send a signal to the neuron in the hypothalamus. It's going to directly stimulate your sympathetic nervous system, right? That goes into your medulla. Remember, anything inside here, the inner part is the medulla. And what is that going to do? That's going to cause these catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, to be released into your bloodstream. And it's going to cause all these wonderful effects, right? Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. You're going to have more glucose released. Your liver is going to take glycogen and break it down. Glycogen is just a bunch of glucoses stuck together. And remember, we need one single glucose to turn it into ATP. It's going to dilate the bronchioles so you can get more oxygen. It's going to change the blood flow patterns, get more blood flow to your brain, to your heart, to your skeletal muscles, and increase your metabolic rate. Increase the amount of glucose and oxygen you can turn into ATP. Do it faster, right? So this is an example of a direct neural, right? Neural stimulus. We have a neuron carrying the message to the gland, okay? And then it releases a hormone. So this is one of those examples of a neural stimulus releasing a hormone. In the beginning of the endocrine system chapter, it talks about these different stimuli, and I talked about it last lecture that you should go brush up on it if you haven't seen it. We also had humoral, which I don't have an exact example here, but if you go back to the adrenal cortex, when we talked about monitoring blood flow or monitoring the amount of potassium that you had in your system, that would be an example of humoral. Monitoring the blood flow or what's in the blood, and then having a hormone release based on blood. That was humoral. Then this example here, this on the second side of the page, when we have a more prolonged stress, this is a great example of hormonal, right? So the hypothalamus in this prolonged stress, hypothalamus causes the corticotropin releasing hormone to be released. That hormone triggers what? The anterior pituitary to release ACTH, and then that causes the adrenal cortex to release either glucocorticoids or mineralocorticoids. So this is a really good example of a hormonal stimulus. What does that mean? One hormone triggers another hormone to be released. That's it. So why would this be good for long term? Well, what do mineralocorticoids do? They trigger increased potassium, increased water retention, right? So if you increase your water retention, it's going to increase your blood volume. Hey, where'd it go? There we go. I didn't do anything, I promise. Okay, back here. There we go. Silly computer. Okay. No, it still doesn't want to work. Okay, I won't use the pen then. Let me just get through this. So obviously if you have a mineralocorticoid, it's going to increase sodium absorption, increase water retention. The more water you have in your blood, the greater the blood volume. The greater the blood volume, the greater the blood pressure. Why do you want increased blood pressure? You want to be able to get the glucose and the oxygen to your skeletal muscles and your brain and your heart so you can run away from your attacker. It's also going to allow glucocorticoids to be released. What's the major point of glucocorticoids? They're going to take fats and turn them into glucose. And then what are you going to do? You're going to take the glucose and turn it into more energy. It's also going to increase the amount of blood glucose that's floating around your bloodstream. The more glucose in your bloodstream, the more can get to your muscles, the more ATP you can make. It's also going to suppress your immune system. Basically, you want to conserve, if you're in a stressful environment, somebody's mugging you, attacking you, a bear's chasing you, you want to conserve all of your energy to the systems that are going to keep you alive, right? So short term, we're going to bombard you with epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is going to cause all of these increased blood pressure, increased heart rate. If you have stress over a long period of time, not only are we releasing the catecholamines, the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, we're also releasing the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids to help with the long-term conversion of glucose or fats into glucose, or the long-term retention of water to increase your blood volume and increase your blood flow. So again, this is a picture that I would look at and really make sure that I can give as much information. If this was, going to be on your test, could you explain this entire picture? Why is it short term? Why is it long term? What's the difference between a neural stimulus and a hormonal stimulus? Give examples of why catecholamines do what they do. Why do they increase blood pressure? Give an example of why mineralocorticoids increase blood pressure. Talk about how glucocorticoids increase glucose volume, or glucose volume in the blood, to be more specific. So I'd make sure that you could really look at this picture and give as much information as you possibly can about it. All right, let me see if I can get this thing to do what I want it to do now. There we go. This is the very last slide. Hypersecretion of catecholamines. So if you have too much epinephrine or too much norepinephrine, it's this pheochromocytoma, crazy word. Pretty much you have uncontrolled sympathetic nervous system function. So your sympathetic nervous system is telling you constantly to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, but you're not under great stress. It's just constantly being secreted anyway. So what is this going to do? You can go back to that picture and look. I'm going to point it out to you here, but if the pen will do what I want it to do. I just maybe going too fast for the pen. So if you have hypersecretion of these catecholamines, this is going to have hyperglycemia, so increased glucose, right? You're going to have increased metabolic rate. You're going to have increased heart rate. You're going to have hypertension. Why you have hypertension? If you have increased blood volume and you have increased blood pressure, you're going to have hypertension, right? Increased metabolic rate, because you're trying to convert that glucose into as much ATP as possible. So you're going to have increased metabolic rate. The sweating has to do with heating up your body, right? If you're constantly triggering your skeletal muscles to work, then in the contraction they also generate heat. So with contraction heat, if you want to cool your body off, we do sweating, right? And then the sweat is evaporated and it pulls that heat from our body with it, and that's evaporative cooling. So you can go back and look at the picture and on this page right here and look at all the things that would happen if you had a hypersecretion of catecholamines. So you can look here, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, all those good things. All right, I think that's it for this lecture. Enjoy. It can be fun. Just make sure that you go back and you understand all the words and the terms. There's a lot of new terms here. So I would definitely make a little chart. You know, what is a mineralocorticoid aldosterone? What does it do? What is it if there's too much or there's too little? What happens then? So if the more you can chart this information or do some sort of flow chart, the better off you'll be at studying for the next unit exam. Thanks so much for your time, and I'll see you guys next lecture. Bye.